Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to the radio show Woman's Hour with a focus on industry and audience. This video is going to be particularly relevant for you if you are studying Eduqas A-Level Media Studies, as this radio show appears as a set text on that specification for exams from 2024 onwards. For this topic, you need to have studied 2 episodes of Woman's Hour in detail. It doesn't really matter what 2 episodes you or your teachers choose. I'm going to refer to a range of general examples, but you should have a few specific examples from the episodes that you have studied. Woman's Hour appears on BBC Radio 4. It's a daily magazine programme, which means that there are presenters, they have a range of people on to chat to, and they talk about a range of different topics every day. It began decades ago in 1946. The first episode was on BBC Light programme, and it had a male presenter, weirdly, for a Woman's Hour programme. And so at the time, when the programme first started, I suppose it was an attempt to target women who were, at 1946, a growing consumer. And they wanted to have something there to target kind of housewives and people who were at home listening to the radio. But, you could say that this was kind of tokenism, considering they didn't even have a female presenter. Perhaps still reflects the fact that the radio industry and the media industries in general were still reasonably male dominated at the time. Most of the content of Woman's Hour back in the 1940s and 50s centred around things like cooking and cleaning, because that was what was expected of many women at the time. Obviously, over time it has evolved and the content of the show is diversified. It's now broadcast at 10 a.m. daily, and there is also an omnibus on Saturday afternoons at 4 so that people can catch up with everything from the whole week if they've missed it. This is a good way of targeting those audiences who are busy during the week, who aren't at home and who can't listen to the radio during a normal work day. And this is potentially reflective of the fact that more women now than back in the 1940s are not staying at home and are actually off out at work. I suppose the fact that this is still shown or still broadcast at 10 a.m. on a weekday, it does still reflect some assumptions about women being in the home at that time. You can also listen to Woman's Hour on BBC Sounds, which is their online platform for catching up with audio material. The BBC as a company is a very large corporation. It's global. It's obviously mainly based in Britain, but it does have a lot of subsidiaries around the world as well. It is a public service broadcaster, and what that means is it is funded by licence fees and not by adverts. So there are no adverts on BBC Radio 4 or during Woman's Hour. Because of that, it doesn't need to appeal to advertisers, so it doesn't need to appeal to a big mass mainstream audience. It can make shows that are perhaps a bit more niche and unusual. The BBC has a remit to inform, educate and entertain. Obviously, Woman's Hour has some entertaining content. Chatting to people, doing interviews, making jokes, talking about relevant culture. Woman's Hour also is quite informative and education as well, tackling a wide range of issues that women might enjoy learning about. For example, there are lots of times where they've talked in the past about things like IVF, adoption, mastectomies, the menopause, lots of women's issues, educating their audience about these issues, talking about health concerns. So a real focus on female-led content and issues that affect mostly female audience. Because it's licence fee funded and the BBC has gone through a range of budget cuts in the last few years, the show itself is reasonably low cost to produce and to broadcast. It's recorded in a studio, there's a couple of hosts, it's mostly dialogue, so people talking, and it can be distributed digitally as well, so keeping costs relatively low. At the moment, the show has 2 presenters. Obviously, this may change by the time that you study this radio programme, and that's fine. But at the moment, the 2 presenters are Emma Barnett. She has a history at the BBC. She's presented Radio 5, Newsnight. She's quite a light-hearted presenter. You've also got Anita Rani, who has also a history at the BBC presenting things like Countryfile. She's an Indian presenter. She's done a lot for the BBC on terms of things like documentaries about Bollywood too. So potentially including a presenter from an ethnic minority background because of the BBC's desire to reflect more diversity and to reflect the growing diversity across Britain. The fact that we now have two female presenters presenting Woman's Hour instead of a male presenter like they did in 1946 just goes to show that we have hopefully moved on at least somewhat in terms of our attitudes towards women. We now, there are much more female presenters within the radio industry, and the BBC encourages this again because they want to show diversity within their programming. It also perhaps reflects the kind of rise of feminism and the Me Too movements in the UK and abroad as well.
As well as the choice of presenters, the content on Woman's Hour also reflects the BBC's remit to really embrace diversity. So you can see a lot of the content it includes people from different ethnicities, people from different genders, gender identities, sexualities, disabilities, etc. So really trying to embrace a slightly more diverse representation, perhaps in order to target a more diverse audience, but also definitely reflecting that remit, the obligation to be diverse as well.
A lot of female audiences are going to enjoy the content that is on this radio show because it reflects a lot of things that happen to them in their lives. It's quite relatable, it's identifiable, it's familiar content to them. It perhaps includes content that is very rarely talked about on other radio shows or in the media at all. Talking about women's health is often thought of as being quite taboo and something that, you know, should be hidden away and not really spoken about. And so talking in reasonable detail about topics which can be quite difficult to chat about for women helps perhaps to bring light to certain issues.
There's also a lot of content on Woman's Hour that is very appealing to their older target audience. Woman's Hour audience is primarily over the age of 55.
The show offers some interactive content online for women, and in particular, I guess, with its presence on social media, on things like Facebook to target those slightly older audiences, and on Twitter. It allows women to be able to like and share and comment on some of the content that has been on the show. You can see as well on their social media that not every audience responds to this radio show in the same way. There are some audiences that don't like the content or disagree with the content. Maybe they dislike the presenters or they think the show has changed too much over the years. So there's a variety of both preferred and negotiated and oppositional readings available for you to see online. Of course, having a show aimed at women about women's issues is inevitably going to annoy some men. There are some men who feel that the show alienates them and having a woman's hour is somehow sexist. There are some audiences who don't respond well to this. And some women, I guess, may still feel alienated by the fact that the show seems to focus on reasonably traditional still women's activities. You know, there is still some focus on things like relationships and marriage. There is still some focus on things like gardening and housework and cooking. And so not every audience is going to be happy with Woman's Hour. Ofcom is the regulatory board that governs radio within the UK. They are responsible for making sure that radio programmes do not breach the communications code, which includes controls over things like swearing, hate speech, sexualised content, etc. The fact that this show is on at 10 a.m. means it's got to be reasonably family-friendly content. They couldn't really put anything too graphic or too adult in terms of the chats.
One thing the BBC did was to actually split the programme off so that it had a kind of spin-off show called Late Night Woman's Hour. And that meant that they could put their more adult content on, the stuff that was a little bit more controversial, on late at night, hopefully to try and avoid, getting into trouble perhaps with Ofcom. This is very reflective of the fact that radio listenership is actually on the decline. Lots of people are no longer listening to radio, and perhaps the BBC is very aware that the audience for Woman's Hour is getting older and older, and there is a need to target a slightly younger audience to ensure that they still have listeners, in the hope that perhaps the listeners of Late Night Woman's Hour will also end up listening to Woman's Hour in the future.
So Ofcom very rarely have to get involved with something like Woman's Hour. However, sometimes audiences do complain. In 2021, Ofcom received 564 complaints which was sent both to Ofcom and to the director of the BBC, and it accused the host Emma Barnett of being quite hostile towards a Muslim guest that was on their show, being quite aggressive and perhaps showing some bias against her. Audiences were quite outraged and upset and wanted something done about it, and so the BBC actually removed the clip from their online catalogue. So, the BBC actually taking responsibility for some self-regulation there to try and appease audiences and to try and avoid any bad publicity or sanctions from Ofcom. So that was my easy to understand guide to Woman's Hour. If you would like any other videos that I don't already have on my channel, just leave a little comment below and I'll see what I can do. But feel free to subscribe for other videos that might be relevant to you.